There is a kind of silence that money can buy, and it sounds like this: the rustle of heavy paper being folded and placed inside an envelope, the soft click of a mahogany door closing in a law office where no one raises their voice, the absence of a name in a newspaper that was supposed to print it. In the grand estates of America's oldest families, scandal was not a spectacle. It was a problem to be solved quietly, expensively, and completely. The Whitneys knew this. The Astors understood it. The Vanderbilts practiced it with the efficiency of a bank counting money. When a son gambled away a fortune, when a daughter ran off with an unsuitable man, when a business partner threatened exposure, when a servant knew too much, the families did not panic. They made a phone call. They wrote a check. They activated a network of lawyers, fixers, and editors who understood that certain stories were better left untold, and the scandal disappeared, not into thin air, but into the quiet machinery of wealth protecting itself. This is the story of how they did it, and what it cost them. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. In 1890, when the Gilded Age was at its height and fortunes were counted in the tens of millions, the old money families of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia discovered something that new money had not yet learned. Wealth alone was not enough. You needed a system. You needed lawyers who understood discretion the way priests understood confession. You needed newspaper editors who valued a relationship with your family more than they valued a headline. You needed private detectives who could find information and make sure it never traveled further than your drawing room. You needed bank managers who would move money without asking questions. And you needed other families like yours, who understood that protecting one scandal meant protecting all of them, because today's victim of exposure might be tomorrow's ally against the same threat. The system was not written down. There were no contracts, no formal agreements, no membership rosters. It existed in handshakes and dinner invitations and quiet understandings that passed from father to son like inheritances. If a Morgan needed a problem solved, a Rockefeller would help. If a Mellon faced exposure, a Carnegie would intervene. Not out of friendship, though friendship might exist, but out of shared interest. The walls that protected one mansion protected them all. The mechanics were simple. A scandal emerged. Perhaps a son had been caught in a compromising position at a gambling house. Perhaps a daughter had been seen in the company of a man her parents had forbidden her to see. Perhaps a business transaction had crossed a legal line and a journalist was asking questions. The family did not wait for the story to break. They acted immediately, quietly, and with the full force of their resources. Step 1 was containment. A lawyer, usually from a firm that had served the family for decades, would visit the parties involved. The journalist, the witness, the victim, whoever held the information. The conversation was always polite, always respectful, always clear. There was an offer on the table, money usually. Sometimes a great deal of money, enough to change a life, to pay off debts, to secure a future, and in exchange, silence. Not a legal document, though those existed too, just an understanding that the story would not be told, the name would not be mentioned, the scandal would not be pursued. Most people accepted. A working journalist in 1900 might earn $1,200 a year. A family like the Vanderbilts could offer $10,000 for silence, and it would be considered cheap. For someone struggling to survive, the choice was not difficult. You took the money, you kept quiet, and you moved on with your life, which was now considerably easier than it had been. But money was not the only tool. Sometimes the offer came with a warning, not explicit, never a threat, just a reminder of the power imbalance. The family had resources. They had connections to judges, to police commissioners, to mayors and governors. If cooperation was not forthcoming, life could become difficult. Employment could be lost. Credit could be denied. Rumors could spread. Nothing illegal, nothing traceable, just the quiet exercise of influence that reminded everyone involved where the power truly resided. And if money and warnings were not enough, there were other methods. Evidence could disappear. Witnesses could be discredited. Stories could be reframed, transformed from scandals into misunderstandings, from crimes into unfortunate incidents that reflected poorly on everyone involved and were best forgotten. The newspaper editors were the most important part of the system. In the 1890s, most major newspapers were owned by men who moved in the same social circles as the old money families. They attended the same clubs, sat on the same charitable boards, married into the same networks of wealth and influence. When a scandal threatened one of their peers, they understood that publishing it would damage not just one family, but the entire structure that protected them all, so they killed the story. Not through censorship, though that happened too, but through editorial judgment. The story was not newsworthy, the sources were unreliable, the information was unverified. There were a dozen reasons not to publish, and they all led to the same outcome: silence. But silence required maintenance. A scandal suppressed in 1900 might resurface in 1910 if someone decided to write a memoir or give an interview or simply talk to a different journalist. So the families maintained relationships, continued the payments, renewed the understandings. A journalist who had been paid off once might be hired by the family as a consultant, paid an annual retainer to provide advice on public relations. A witness who had been silenced might receive ongoing financial support, enough to keep them comfortable and loyal. A lawyer who had handled a sensitive matter might be kept on retainer indefinitely, ensuring that their knowledge never travelled beyond the walls of their office. The cost was enormous, but the families considered it an investment. J.P. Morgan once said that he would rather pay $1 million to prevent a scandal than spend $10,000 defending against it after it became public. The logic was sound. A public scandal could destroy reputations, collapse business deals, ruin marriages, shatter inheritances. The cost of prevention was always cheaper than the cost of recovery. And so they paid, year after year, decade after decade, building a vast invisible infrastructure of silence that protected their names and their fortunes from the consequences of their actions. The old money families did not see this as corruption. They saw it as responsibility. They were stewards of legacies that stretched back generations and forward into a future they would never see. Their duty was to protect those legacies, to ensure that the wealth and status they had inherited would pass intact to their children and grandchildren. If that required buying silence, if it required suppressing truth, if it required bending the mechanisms of justice and journalism to serve their interests, then so be it. They were not accountable to the public. They were accountable only to their families, to the names they carried, to the fortunes they guarded. And they guarded them with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to every other aspect of their lives. By 1910, the system was so well established that it functioned almost automatically. A scandal would emerge, a phone call would be made, a lawyer would visit, money would change hands, and the story would disappear. No drama, no public confrontation, no messy trials or sensational headlines. Just the quiet machinery of wealth protecting itself, invisible to those outside the system, indispensable to those within it. But systems built on silence carry their own weight. Every scandal suppressed was a secret that had to be guarded. Every person paid off was a potential vulnerability. Every journalist bought was a reminder that truth could be purchased, which meant it could also be sold to someone willing to pay more. The families understood this. They accepted it as the cost of their position, and they continued paying because the alternative, exposure, was unthinkable. The architecture of silence was not a single building, but a vast interconnected structure, built room by room, payoff by payoff, over decades. It had no blueprints, no central authority, no formal organization. It existed in the shared understanding of the families who used it and the professionals who maintained it, and it worked, for a very long time, until it did not. In the spring of 1893, Cornelius Vanderbilt III, grandson of the railroad magnate who had built one of America's greatest fortunes, was 23 years old and engaged to be married to a young woman from a respectable but not wealthy family. The engagement had been announced in the society pages. The wedding was planned for June, and then, in April, a problem emerged. A young woman named Sarah Bennett appeared at the offices of the New York World with a story. She claimed that Cornelius had promised to marry her, that they had been intimate, and that she was now pregnant with his child. She had letters, she said, written in his hand, that proved the relationship. She wanted justice, or failing that, she wanted compensation. The editor of The World, a man named Charles Anderson, listened to her story, examined the letters, and recognized immediately that he was holding dynamite. The Vanderbilt name was one of the most powerful in America. A scandal of this nature would sell newspapers for weeks. It would be a sensation. But Anderson was also a practical man. He knew that publishing the story would bring consequences. The Vanderbilts had resources, connections, and a long memory. They could make his life difficult in ways he could not fully anticipate. So he did what editors in his position often did. He sent a message to the Vanderbilt family through an intermediary, letting them know that a story was in development and that they might want to be aware of it before it went to print. The message reached William Kissam Vanderbilt, Cornelius's father, within hours. William did not panic. He did not confront his son. He simply activated the system. He called his lawyer, a man named Chauncey Depew, who had handled sensitive matters for the family for years. Depew understood immediately what needed to be done. He visited Sarah Bennett at her boarding house. The conversation was brief and polite. He did not dispute her story. He did not question the authenticity of the letters. He simply made an offer. $50,000, paid immediately, in exchange for her silence and the return of the letters. It was more money than Sarah could have imagined. $50,000 in 1893 was equivalent to over $1.5 million today. It was enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, to never work again, to raise a child in security and comfort. She accepted. The letters were handed over. The money was transferred, not directly from the Vanderbilts, but through a series of intermediaries that made it impossible to trace. Sarah Bennett signed a document agreeing never to speak about Cornelius Vanderbilt or the circumstances of their relationship. Then she left New York. She moved to San Francisco, where no one knew her, and lived quietly under a different name. Chauncey Depew returned to the Vanderbilt estate and reported that the matter was resolved. The cost had been $50,000. William Vanderbilt did not flinch. He considered it cheap. His son's reputation was intact. The engagement continued. The wedding took place in June as planned. The society pages covered it extensively, describing the flowers and the dress and the guest list. There was no mention of Sarah Bennett. There was no mention of the letters. There was no scandal. Charles Anderson at the New York World never published the story. He had been prepared to, but when he reached out to Sarah Bennett for a follow-up interview, she was gone. He could not find her, and without her testimony, without the letters, he had no story. He could have pursued it, could have investigated further, could have written about the disappearance itself. But he chose not to. The Vanderbilts had relationships with his publishers. They advertised in his newspaper. They were powerful allies and dangerous enemies. Anderson decided the story was not worth the trouble. Years later, in 1920, a journalist named Samuel Hopkins Adams was researching a book about the Gilded Age and came across a reference to Sarah Bennett in some old correspondence. He tracked her down in San Francisco, where she was living under the name Sarah Whitman. She was in her 50s by then, comfortably settled, her child long since grown. Adams asked her about Cornelius Vanderbilt. She refused to discuss it. He offered her money for an interview. She declined. He pointed out that Cornelius was dead, that William Vanderbilt was dead, that the scandal was old history and could no longer harm anyone. Sarah smiled and said that some promises lasted a lifetime. She had taken the Vanderbilt money, and she had kept her word. Adams left empty-handed. The story of Sarah Bennett and Cornelius Vanderbilt III was never published. It exists only in fragments, in letters and diaries, and the fading memories of people who heard rumours but never confirmation. The official history of the Vanderbilt family contains no mention of it. Cornelius's marriage, which lasted 30 years until his death in 1932, is recorded as a happy union that produced 4 children. There is no asterisk, no footnote, no acknowledgement that the wedding almost did not happen because of a scandal that was quietly erased with money. This was how the system worked at its best: efficient, invisible, absolute. A problem emerged, resources were deployed, silence was purchased, and life continued as if nothing had happened. The cost was absorbed, the records were buried, and the family moved forward with their reputation intact. But the Vanderbilt incident, erased though it was, revealed something important about the architecture of silence. It was not just about buying off victims. It was about controlling information at every level: the source, the intermediaries, the journalists, even the historians who might try to reconstruct the past decades later. Sarah Bennett was paid to stay silent. Charles Anderson chose not to publish. Samuel Hopkins Adams found only dead ends. The story was sealed at every point where it might have emerged, and the seal held because everyone involved understood that the Vanderbilt's power extended across time, across distance, across the boundaries that ordinarily separate the powerful from the powerless. The $50,000 Sarah Bennett received was real. She used it. She lived on it. She raised her child with it. But the silence she sold was also real, and it lasted the rest of her life. She died in 1948 at the age of 76. Her obituary, published in a small San Francisco newspaper, identified her as Sarah Whitman, a retired schoolteacher who had lived quietly and left no survivors. There was no mention of the Vanderbilts. The scandal that never happened remained buried, and the family's reputation remained pristine. In 1902, Eleanor Worthington, daughter of one of Boston's oldest and wealthiest families, was 18 years old and beautiful in the way that made mothers nervous and fathers vigilant. She had been raised in a world of rules, explicit and unspoken, about behaviour, reputation, and the preservation of family honour. She attended the right schools, wore the right clothes, socialised with the right people. Her future was mapped out clearly. She would marry well, to a man from a family of similar standing, and she would carry the Worthington name forward into the next generation with dignity and grace. But Eleanor had a secret. She was in love with Thomas Brennan, the son of a construction foreman who worked on properties the Worthingtons owned. Thomas was handsome, kind, ambitious in the way that working men are when they dream of rising beyond their station. He read books. He wrote poetry. He talked about building things, not with his hands like his father, but with ideas, with plans, with a vision of a better world. Eleanor met him by accident. She had been walking in Franklin Park one afternoon, escorted by a maid who was more interested in flirting with a gardener than watching her charge. Thomas was there, sitting on a bench reading. They struck up a conversation. It was innocent at first, just talk about books and weather and the city. But they met again the next week, and the week after that, and soon the meetings were no longer accidental. By the summer of 1902, Eleanor and Thomas were meeting twice a week, always in the park, always chaperoned by the same inattentive maid who had been quietly bribed to look the other way. They talked for hours. Thomas told her about his father's work, the long days and dangerous conditions, the pride of building something that would last. Eleanor told him about her world, the stifling expectations, the endless social obligations, the sense that her life was not her own, but a performance stage for an audience she had never chosen. They fell in love the way young people do, with intensity and certainty and no sense of the obstacles that stood between them. In August, Thomas asked Eleanor to marry him. He had no ring, no fortune, no prospects that would impress her family. But he had love, and he believed naively that love might be enough. Eleanor said yes. She knew her parents would never approve, but she thought, also naively, that once the marriage was done, once it was a fact they could not undo, they would accept it. She was wrong. Eleanor's plan was to elope. Thomas would arrange everything. They would leave Boston, travel to New York, and marry there. By the time her family discovered what had happened, it would be too late to stop them. She would be Mrs. Thomas Brennan, and her parents would have to make peace with the reality. But secrets are fragile things, and the maid who'd been bribed to look away was also being watched. Another servant, loyal to the Worthington family, had noticed the absences, the whispered conversations, the letters Eleanor received and hid in her room. This servant reported to Eleanor's mother, who reported to her father, and within days the entire plan was uncovered. James Worthington, Eleanor's father, did not rage or threaten. He simply acted with the cold efficiency that had made him successful in business. He sent for his lawyer, a man named Richard Howe, and explained the situation. His daughter was planning to elope with an unsuitable man. The marriage could not be allowed to happen. The young man needed to disappear, and the incident needed to be forgotten. Richard Howe nodded. He had handled similar situations before. He knew what needed to be done. The first step was Thomas Brennan. Howe visited him at the construction site where his father worked. He pulled him aside, away from the other labourers, and explained the situation in terms that were clear but not unkind. Eleanor Worthington was not going to marry him. The family would not allow it. Thomas could resist, could pursue the relationship, could try to elope as planned, but if he did, the consequences would be severe. His father would lose his job. The Worthingtons owned significant property in Boston and had relationships with every major construction firm in the city. A word from James Worthington would ensure that neither Thomas nor his father would work in Boston again. Or, Richard Howe continued, Thomas could accept an alternative. The Worthingtons were prepared to offer him $10,000 and a letter of introduction to a construction company in Chicago. It was a generous offer, far more than a young labourer could expect to earn in years. It was enough to start a new life, far from Boston, far from Eleanor. Thomas was devastated. He loved Eleanor. He had believed their love was real, that it could overcome the barriers of class and wealth. But he also understood power, and he understood that the Worthingtons had more of it than he could fight. He thought about his father, about the years of hard work that could be erased with a single conversation. He thought about Eleanor, about whether she would really be happy living in poverty, married to a man her family disowned. He thought about the $10,000, about what it could mean for his future. He took the money. He signed a document promising never to contact Eleanor Worthington again. He left Boston within a week. The letter of introduction to the Chicago construction company was real. Thomas Brennan used it, found work, and over the years built a successful career. He married someone else in 1908. He had children. He lived a good life. But he never forgot Eleanor, and he never fully forgave himself for taking the money. Eleanor knew none of this at first. She waited for Thomas at their arranged meeting place, a bench in Franklin Park on the day they were supposed to elope. He did not come. She waited for hours. She returned the next day and the day after that. He never appeared. She tried to send letters, but they were intercepted by her parents. She asked the maid what had happened, but the maid, frightened by her own role in the affair, claimed to know nothing. Eleanor was heartbroken, and then angry, and then, as weeks passed and Thomas remained absent, resigned. She believed he had abandoned her, that his promises had been empty, that she had been a fool to trust him. Her parents said nothing. They simply resumed her schedule of social engagements, of dinners and dances and carefully supervised encounters with eligible young men. Eleanor went through the motions. She attended the parties. She smiled at the appropriate times. She accepted the courtship of a man named Robert Ashford, a banker from a respectable family, and in 1904 she married him. The wedding was grand, covered extensively in the society pages. Eleanor wore white and smiled for the photographers and said the words she was expected to say. But inside, something had broken. She spent the rest of her life wondering what had happened to Thomas Brennan, why he had abandoned her, whether he had ever loved her at all. It was not until 1935, when her mother was dying, that Eleanor learned the truth. Her mother, in a moment of guilt or perhaps just exhaustion, told her about the $10,000, about the letter to Chicago, about the decision that had been made to protect the family's reputation. Eleanor was 61 years old by then. She had been married to Robert Ashford for 31 years. She had 3 children and 6 grandchildren. Her life had been comfortable, respectable, exactly what her parents had wanted for her. But hearing the truth, learning that Thomas had not abandoned her but had been driven away, that the choice had been made for her without her knowledge or consent, broke something that had already been cracked for decades. She did not forgive her mother. She sat beside the deathbed in silence until the old woman passed. Then she left the room and never spoke of it again. Eleanor Worthington Ashford died in 1952. Her obituary described her as a devoted wife and mother, a pillar of Boston society, a woman who had lived with grace and dignity. There was no mention of Thomas Brennan. There was no mention of the summer of 1902, when she'd been 18, and in love and believed that love might be enough to overcome the weight of old money and family expectations. The cost of making Eleanor's mistake disappear had been $10,000, paid to Thomas Brennan, and whatever additional sums were paid to the maid, to the lawyer, to the servants who knew fragments of the story. Perhaps $15,000 in total, equivalent to nearly $500,000 today. The Worthingtons considered it money well spent. Their daughter had been saved from a disastrous marriage. The family's reputation remained intact. The incident was forgotten, buried so deeply that even Eleanor herself had not known the full truth until decades later. But the cost was not just financial. Eleanor had spent 30 years believing she'd been abandoned by the man she loved. Thomas had spent 30 years knowing he had sold his love for money, and both of them carried the weight of that summer for the rest of their lives, unable to talk about it, unable to resolve it, unable to know whether they had been victims or collaborators in their own tragedy. This was what the architecture of silence demanded. Not just money, but lives bent, and shaped, and sometimes broken to preserve the appearance of propriety. The old money families paid the financial cost without hesitation, but the human cost that was borne by the people who disappeared into silence, who lived with secrets they could never share, who wondered for the rest of their lives what might have been if wealth had not intervened. In 1908, a young journalist named Daniel Crawford was working for the Philadelphia Inquirer, covering business and finance. He was 29 years old, ambitious, talented, and convinced that journalism could change the world by exposing corruption and holding the powerful accountable. He believed in the ideals he had learned in school, about truth and transparency and the public's right to know. He had not yet learned that some truths were more expensive than others. Daniel was investigating a railroad deal that involved several prominent Philadelphia families, including the Biddles and the Drexels. The deal was complex, involving land purchases, municipal contracts, and favourable terms negotiated with city officials. On the surface, it was legal. But Daniel suspected that money had changed hands improperly, that officials had been bribed, that the families involved had used their influence to secure advantages that ordinary businessmen could never access. He spent months researching, interviewing sources, reviewing public records, piecing together a narrative that would demonstrate how wealth and power operated beyond the boundaries of law when the law became inconvenient. By the summer of 1908, Daniel had enough material for a series of articles that would run for weeks and cause significant embarrassment to the families involved. He wrote the first piece and submitted it to his editor. The editor read it, recognized the implications, and sat on it for 3 days. Then he called Daniel into his office and explained that the article would not be published. Daniel was stunned. He demanded an explanation. The editor, a man named George Whittaker, was frank. The families named in the article were powerful. They had relationships with the newspaper's owners. Publishing the piece would create problems, legal problems, financial problems, problems that George did not want to deal with, Daniel argued. He pointed out that the facts were solid, that the story was important, that it was exactly the kind of journalism the Inquirer claimed to stand for. George listened, then told him the conversation was over. The article would not run. Daniel refused to accept it. He took the story to other newspapers, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune. All of them declined. The story was too sensitive. The families were too powerful. The risk was too great. Daniel grew angry, then desperate. He had spent months on this investigation. He believed in it. He could not accept that it would simply disappear because the people involved had enough money to suppress it. That was when he made his mistake. He contacted one of the families directly, thinking that if he confronted them, if he gave them a chance to respond, perhaps he could shame them into allowing the story to be published. He sent a letter to Edward Biddle, one of the principals in the railroad deal, explaining that he had evidence of impropriety and was planning to publish it. He asked for a comment. Edward Biddle did not reply. Instead, he called his lawyer, a man named Thomas Willing, and explained the situation. A journalist had material that could be damaging. The story needed to be stopped. Thomas Willing understood. He asked for Daniel Crawford's name and employment history. Then, he made a series of phone calls. Within a week, Daniel Crawford was fired from the Philadelphia Inquirer. The reason given was budget cuts. The newspaper was reorganizing its staff. Daniel's position was being eliminated. It was not personal, just business. Daniel knew better. He tried to find work at other newspapers, but everywhere he applied he was told that there were no openings, that his qualifications were impressive but not quite what they were looking for, that they would keep his application on file. He was being blacklisted quietly and efficiently by men he had never met who were protecting interests he had tried to expose. By the fall of 1908, Daniel Crawford was unemployed and running out of money. He had rent to pay, debts accumulating, and no prospects. He was angry, but also frightened. He had not realized how vulnerable he was, how easily his career could be destroyed by people who operated systems he did not fully understand. That was when Thomas Willing visited him. The conversation took place in a quiet restaurant in Philadelphia. Willing was polite, even sympathetic. He acknowledged that Daniel had been treated unfairly. He explained that the families involved in the railroad deal had influence, that they had used it to protect their interests, and that Daniel had been caught in the machinery of that protection. He said it was unfortunate, but it was reality. Then he made an offer. The families were willing to compensate Daniel for the work he had done on the story that would never be published. They were prepared to pay him $5,000. In addition, Willing had connections to several corporations that needed communications professionals. He could arrange an interview, a well-paying position that would utilize Daniel's skills in a different context. The job would pay significantly more than journalism. It would be secure, respectable, and free of the frustrations Daniel had experienced trying to publish stories that powerful people did not want published. Daniel understood what was being offered. Money to go away, a job to keep him quiet, and an implicit warning that refusing would mean continued unemployment and financial ruin. He was not being bought, he was being managed. He accepted. The $5,000 was paid within days. The job interview was arranged. Daniel was hired as a communications director for a manufacturing company with ties to the Biddle family. The work was dull but well compensated. He wrote press releases and internal newsletters, he attended meetings, he performed the tasks expected of him. He stopped being a journalist. The railroad deal was never exposed. The story Daniel had spent months researching remained unpublished. The families involved continued their business without interruption. The officials who had been bribed were never held accountable. The system Daniel had tried to challenge absorbed him instead, turning him from a critic into an employee. Years later, in 1935, Daniel Crawford was working as a senior executive at the same manufacturing company. He was financially secure, respected in his community, and utterly disconnected from the ideals he'd held as a young journalist. He had a wife, 3 children, a comfortable home. He had succeeded by the standards most people use to measure success. But he had lost something that could not be measured, the belief that his work mattered, that truth could compete with power, that journalism could change anything. He died in 1953 at the age of 74. His obituary described him as a successful businessman and devoted family man. There was no mention of the railroad investigation. There was no mention of the articles that were never published. The story of how a young journalist tried to expose corruption and was instead absorbed into the system he had tried to challenge was known only to a few people, most of whom were also dead. The cost of Daniel Crawford's silence had been $5,000 and a job. It was cheap compared to other scandals the families had suppressed, but it was also revealing. The old money families did not just pay off victims and witnesses, they co-opted critics, turning them into employees, binding them with financial dependence so that their silence was not just purchased but maintained through ongoing self-interest. Daniel Crawford became complicit in his own silencing. He took the money, accepted the job, and spent the rest of his life living with the knowledge that he had betrayed the ideals he once believed in. He did not see himself as corrupt. He saw himself as practical, as someone who had learned how the world worked and adapted accordingly. But late at night, in moments of reflection he tried not to have, he wondered what might have happened if he had refused the offer, if he had continued fighting, if he had been willing to sacrifice his career and his security for the principle that some stories needed to be told no matter the cost. He never found an answer. The question haunted him, quietly, for the rest of his life. And when he died, it died with him, leaving no record, no confession, no explanation of how a young man with ideals became an old man with regrets. The families who had silenced him were not cruel. They had simply been efficient. They had identified a problem, deployed resources, and neutralized the threat. Daniel Crawford was not destroyed. He was redirected, his energy channeled away from exposure and toward employment. The system worked because it understood that most people were not heroes. They were human. They had needs, fears, and vulnerabilities that could be addressed with money and opportunity. The families did not need to break Daniel Crawford. They only needed to make it easier for him to stop fighting than to continue. And they did. And he did. And the scandal disappeared, along with his belief that truth mattered more than survival. By 1910, the system of suppressing scandals had evolved from a collection of individual actions into something more comprehensive and more troubling. It was no longer just families protecting themselves. It was a network of institutions, lawyers, editors, bankers, police officials, and politicians who understood that their own prosperity depended on maintaining the status quo. They were not conspirators in any formal sense. They did not meet in secret rooms to plan cover-ups. They simply recognized that their interests aligned. that helping one family today might mean receiving help tomorrow, and that exposing scandal was bad for everyone involved. The city of Philadelphia was a perfect example. In 1910, Philadelphia was dominated by a small number of old families: the Biddles, the Drexels, the Whartons, the Cadwalladers. These families owned banks, railroads, factories, newspapers. They sat on the boards of hospitals and universities and charitable foundations. They controlled access to capital, to jobs, to social standing. If you wanted to succeed in Philadelphia, you needed their approval, or at least their tolerance, and they used that power to shape the city in ways that protected their interests. When a scandal threatened, the response was coordinated across multiple institutions. A journalist might be pressured by his editor, who was pressured by the newspaper's owner, who was pressured by an advertiser, who was connected to the family involved in the scandal. A witness might be visited by a lawyer, who was referred by a judge, who owed his appointment to a politician, who owed his campaign funding to the family. The police might decline to investigate, not because they were explicitly bribed, though that happened too, but because the department's budget was influenced by city officials who were influenced by donors who were connected to the families. It was a web, intricate and strong, woven from relationships and dependencies that made it nearly impossible for any single person to challenge the system without facing consequences from multiple directions. The Drexel family, one of the most powerful in Philadelphia, perfected this approach. They owned Drexel and Company, a major banking house. They had investments in railroads, real estate, and manufacturing. They were patrons of the arts, donors to hospitals, founders of schools. Their name was synonymous with Philadelphia society. In 1911, a scandal emerged that threatened their reputation. Francis Drexel, the youngest son of the family patriarch, was accused of embezzling funds from a trust he managed for a client. The client, a widow named Margaret Thornton, had entrusted Francis with managing her late husband's estate, a sum of approximately $200,000. She expected the money to generate income that would support her and her children. Instead, over several years, Francis had siphoned off funds for his own use, covering the theft with false accounting and delayed payments. By the time Margaret realized what was happening, over $80,000 was missing. She went to a lawyer, a man named James Sullivan, who was not part of the old money network. Sullivan reviewed the evidence and told her she had a strong case. He prepared to file charges. But before the case could proceed, the Drexel family intervened. They did not deny the theft. They acknowledged privately that Francis had made serious mistakes. But they argued that a public trial would benefit no one. Margaret would face years of litigation, with no guarantee of recovery. The family's reputation would be damaged, which would affect their business operations, which in turn could affect the Philadelphia economy, since Drexel and Company was a major employer and lender. It was better, they suggested, to resolve the matter quietly. The Drexel family offered Margaret a settlement. They would return the full $80,000 that had been stolen, plus an additional $50,000 as compensation for her trouble and distress. In exchange, she would sign an agreement never to discuss the matter publicly and never to pursue legal action against Francis or the family. James Sullivan, her lawyer, advised her to reject the offer and proceed with the case. He believed they could win a larger judgment, perhaps recover the full $200,000 plus punitive damages. But Margaret was practical. She was a widow with children to support. The settlement offered financial security, immediate and guaranteed. A trial offered uncertainty, expense, and the possibility that the Drexels would use their influence to drag the case out for years. She accepted the settlement. The money was transferred, the documents were signed, and Francis Drexel quietly left Philadelphia. He moved to Europe, where the family had banking connections, and spent the rest of his life working in their London office. There was no trial, no public exposure, no scandal. The Drexel family's reputation remained intact. James Sullivan was furious. He felt that justice had been subverted, that a criminal had escaped consequences because of his family's wealth and influence. But there was nothing he could do. His client had made her choice, and he was bound by attorney-client privilege not to discuss the details. He tried to interest newspapers in the story, anonymously, but found no takers. The editors he contacted either declined to pursue it, or suggested that without Margaret Thornton's cooperation, there was no story to publish. Sullivan eventually dropped the matter, frustrated but powerless. What he did not know was that the Drexel family had anticipated his efforts. They had quietly contacted the major newspapers in Philadelphia, not to threaten or bribe, but simply to remind editors of the family's long-standing relationships, their advertising purchases, their support for various charitable causes the newspapers covered favourably. The message was subtle, but clear. Publishing a story about Francis Drexel's embezzlement would damage those relationships. And in a city where the Drexel family's influence touched every institution, damaged relationships had consequences. The editors understood. They killed the story before it was ever written. This was the web at work. Margaret Thornton was paid off. James Sullivan was marginalised. Francis Drexel was sent away. The newspapers remained silent, and the machinery of protection moved smoothly, almost invisibly, ensuring that the scandal disappeared without ever becoming public knowledge. The cost was $130,000, paid to Margaret Thornton. But the real investment was not financial. It was the decades of relationship building, the donations and board memberships and social connections that gave the Drexel family the leverage to suppress the story across multiple institutions simultaneously. They had built a system where their power was not just personal, but structural, embedded in the city's economic and social fabric so deeply that challenging them meant challenging the entire network. By 1915, the web had expanded beyond Philadelphia. The old money families of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago had developed informal but effective methods of sharing information about potential threats. A journalist who tried to expose scandal in New York might find himself blacklisted not just there, but in every major city. A lawyer who pursued a case too aggressively in Boston might discover that his practice suffered as clients mysteriously disappeared. The families protected each other because they understood that their collective power was greater than any individual family's resources. An attack on one was an attack on all, and the defense was coordinated, efficient, and overwhelming. The web was not perfect. Some scandals were too large to suppress. Some journalists were too determined to be bought off. Some victims refused settlements no matter how generous. But these were exceptions. The vast majority of scandals that threatened old money families between 1890 and 1920 were successfully contained, suppressed, or erased. The public never knew about them. The families involved continued their lives with reputations intact, and the system strengthened with each success, becoming more refined, more effective, more confident in its ability to control information and shape reality. The web held not because it was strong in any one place, but because it was everywhere, woven into every institution that mattered, every relationship that conferred power, every transaction that required trust. It was invisible to those outside it, and indispensable to those within it. And it worked, for generations, until the world changed in ways the old money families could not control and could not buy their way out of. Not every scandal could be suppressed. In 1916, the Morrison family of Boston learned this the hard way. The Morrisons were old money, wealthy for 3 generations, prominent in banking and shipping. They lived in a mansion on Beacon Hill, attended the right churches, belonged to the right clubs, and maintained the appearance of propriety that defined their class. But beneath the surface, the family was troubled. Charles Morrison, the patriarch, was a hard man, controlling and distant. His wife Catherine had retreated into laudanum and isolation years earlier. Their son, William, was 32 years old in 1916, unmarried, and struggling with alcoholism that the family tried to hide. William's drinking had been a problem for years. He had been sent to private sanitariums, had made promises to quit, had relapsed repeatedly. The family dealt with it by keeping him at home, limiting his social engagements, and ensuring that his condition was not visible to anyone outside their immediate circle. They believed they could manage him, control him, keep the problem contained. In August of 1916, William Morrison was at a private club in Boston, drunk despite his family's efforts to keep him away from alcohol. He got into an argument with another member, a man named Edward Collins. The argument was about nothing important, a comment about politics, a misunderstanding that escalated because both men had been drinking. But William, in his intoxicated state, became violent. He struck Edward Collins with a heavy glass ashtray, hitting him in the head with enough force to fracture his skull. Edward Collins collapsed. Other members of the club rushed to help. Someone called a doctor. but by the time medical assistance arrived, Edward Collins was unconscious and bleeding heavily. He was taken to Massachusetts General Hospital, where he died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. William Morrison was arrested. The police could not ignore a death, even one involving a member of an old money family. The newspapers covered the story. It was sensational. A Beacon Hill heir charged with murder, a prominent family brought low by scandal. Charles Morrison immediately activated the system that had protected his family for generations. He hired the best criminal defense lawyers in Boston. He contacted newspaper editors and asked them to downplay the story. He reached out to the Collins family and offered a settlement, compensation for their loss in exchange for their cooperation in portraying the death as a tragic accident rather than a crime. But this time, the system failed. The Collins family was not wealthy, but they were not poor either. Edward Collins had been a successful merchant with a strong reputation in the community. His family was grieving and angry. They did not want money. They wanted justice. They refused the Morrison family's offers, every one of them, and insisted that William be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The newspapers, sensing a story that readers cared about, continued to cover the case aggressively. The editor of the Boston Globe, who had relationships with the Morrison family and might have been expected to tone down the coverage, declined to do so. His readers wanted the story, and his circulation numbers were rising because of it. Business, in this case, outweighed loyalty. The trial began in November of 1916. Charles Morrison sat in the courtroom every day, watching as his son's life, and by extension his family's reputation, was dissected in public. The prosecution presented evidence of William's drinking, his history of violence, his instability. The defense argued that it had been an accident, that William had not intended to kill Edward Collins, that he was not in his right mind due to intoxication. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found William Morrison guilty of manslaughter. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison. The Morrison family was devastated. Charles had spent a fortune on the defense, over $100,000 in legal fees and related expenses. He had called in every favor, used every connection, deployed every resource. But the system that had always protected his family had failed because the variables, a sympathetic victim, a determined prosecutor, newspapers that prioritized circulation over relationships, had aligned against them. William Morrison served 12 years of his sentence. He was released in 1928, a broken man, his health destroyed by prison and alcohol. He lived in a small apartment in Cambridge, supported by a trust his father had established, and died in 1932 at the age of 48. The Morrison family never recovered from the scandal. Charles Morrison resigned from the boards he had served on for decades. Social invitations stopped arriving. Business partners distanced themselves. The family's bank, Morrison & Sons, suffered as clients took their accounts elsewhere. By 1925, the bank was sold to a larger institution. The Morrison name, once synonymous with respectability and success, became associated with scandal and violence. Charles Morrison died in 1930 at the age of 73. His obituary was brief, noting his business career and his philanthropy, but making no mention of his son or the trial that had destroyed the family's reputation. The cost of trying to suppress the scandal had been enormous, over $200,000 spent on legal fees, settlements offered and rejected, payments to investigators and public relations consultants. But the real cost was the loss of social capital, the relationships and trust and reputation that the family had accumulated over generations, and that could not be rebuilt once destroyed. The Morrison case became a cautionary tale among old money families. It demonstrated that the system had limits, that not every scandal could be suppressed, that there were circumstances, a sympathetic victim, an aggressive prosecutor, newspapers hungry for circulation, where even unlimited resources could not prevent exposure. The lesson was absorbed. Families became more careful, more vigilant, more determined to prevent scandals from reaching the point where suppression was no longer possible. But the Morrison case also revealed something uncomfortable. The system worked best when the victims were powerless, when they could be bought off or intimidated, when they had no leverage and no allies. When the victim's family had resources, when they demanded justice rather than compensation, when public opinion sided with them against the wealthy defendant, the machinery of silence broke down. The old money families did not like this lesson. It suggested that their power was not absolute, that there were boundaries they could not cross, consequences they could not avoid. Some families responded by becoming more cautious, avoiding the behaviours that created scandals in the first place. Others responded by refining their methods, developing more sophisticated techniques for identifying potential problems early and addressing them before they escalated. But all of them understood, after the Morrison case, that the architecture of silence they had built was impressive but not invincible. It could be breached, and when it was breached, the damage was total. William Morrison's conviction did not just destroy his life, it destroyed his family's legacy, erasing 3 generations of accumulated reputation in a single trial. And that, more than any financial cost, was what the old money families feared most. Not poverty. They had too much wealth to ever be truly poor. But obscurity, the loss of the names and status that defined them, the erasure of the legacies they believed they were protecting. The Morrison scandal was a reminder that no amount of money could guarantee that protection forever. The scandals that old money families suppressed were not always about crimes or indiscretions committed by adults. Sometimes the victims were children, and the silence purchased was meant to protect not just reputations, but darker secrets that families did not want examined. In 1921, a young girl named Alice Hartwell was 12 years old and living in the household of the Bradford family in Philadelphia. Alice was not a Bradford by birth. She was the daughter of a woman who had worked as a maid for the family years earlier. Her mother had died when Alice was 5, and the Bradfords, out of charity or obligation, or perhaps guilt, had taken her in. She lived in the servants' quarters, attended a local public school, and helped with household tasks. She was not treated as a member of the family, but she was not quite a servant either. She occupied a liminal space, neither inside nor outside the social boundaries that defined the Bradford household. In the spring of 1921, Alice became pregnant. She was 12 years old. She did not fully understand what was happening to her, did not know the mechanics of reproduction, had not been given any education about her own body. But the changes were undeniable. Her stomach grew. She felt sick in the mornings. The other servants noticed and told Mrs. Bradford. Mrs. Bradford's first reaction was shock, then horror, then a cold, calculating assessment of the situation. She asked Alice how this had happened. Alice, frightened and confused, did not answer clearly. She mentioned an adult man in the household but could not or would not provide details. Mrs. Bradford suspected the truth immediately. Her husband, Jonathan Bradford, had a history that she knew but had chosen to ignore. There had been incidents before, with servants, with young women employed by the family. Mrs. Bradford had dealt with those incidents quietly, paying the women off, ensuring they left the household and never spoke about what had happened. But Alice was a child living under their roof, under their care. This was different. Mrs. Bradford called the family lawyer, a man named Henry Prescott. She explained the situation in clinical terms. A girl in their household was pregnant. She was 12 years old. The family needed the problem to go away quietly, without scandal, without questions. Henry Prescott understood immediately. He asked if Alice had named the father. Mrs. Bradford said she had not, or at least not clearly. Prescott told her that was good. It made the situation manageable. He would handle it. Alice was taken to a private doctor, a man who had handled sensitive matters for wealthy families before. The doctor confirmed the pregnancy. He also arranged for it to be terminated, a procedure that was illegal at the time but available to those who could pay for discretion. Alice underwent the procedure in a private clinic outside Philadelphia. She was terrified, in pain, and alone. No one explained what was happening to her or why. She was simply told that it was necessary, that it would make everything better, that she should not ask questions. Afterwards she was sent away. The Bradfords arranged for her to live with a distant relative in Ohio, a woman who ran a boarding house, and agreed to take Alice in for a monthly payment. Alice was told she could not return to Philadelphia. She was given a small allowance, enough to live on but not enough to be independent. She was 12 years old, traumatized by what had been done to her, and exiled from the only home she'd known. The Bradfords never spoke of her again. Henry Prescott arranged the payments to the boarding house in Ohio, ensuring they continued for years. He also ensured that there were no records of Alice's pregnancy, no medical files, no documentation that could ever be traced back to the Bradford family. The servants in the household were quietly let go, one by one, over the following months, and replaced with new staff who knew nothing about Alice or what had happened. The Bradford family continued their lives without interruption. Jonathan Bradford faced no consequences, no investigation, no questions. His wife chose not to confront him, perhaps because she did not want to know the truth, perhaps because she valued the family's reputation more than justice for a 12-year-old girl. Alice Hartwell lived in Ohio for the rest of her childhood and into adulthood. The woman who ran the boarding house was kind but distant. Alice attended school, eventually found work as a seamstress, and lived quietly, never speaking about her time with the Bradford family. She married in 1932 at the age of 23. Her husband was a factory worker, a decent man who knew nothing about her past. They had 2 children. Alice tried to build a normal life, but the trauma of what had happened to her at 12 never fully left. She suffered from nightmares, from periods of deep sadness, from a sense that something had been stolen from her that she could never recover. She died in 1968 at the age of 59. Her obituary was brief. She was remembered as a devoted wife and mother, a skilled seamstress, a quiet woman who kept to herself. There was no mention of the Bradford family. There was no mention of what had been done to her when she was a child. The silence held, even after her death. The cost of suppressing Alice Hartwell's story had been relatively modest by the standards of old money families. The medical procedure, the payments to the boarding house, the legal fees, perhaps $10,000 total. But the moral cost was incalculable. A child had been violated, traumatized, and exiled to protect the reputation of a wealthy family. And the system had worked exactly as designed, ensuring that the powerful faced no consequences, while the powerless bore the full weight of the damage. Alice's case was not unique. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, countless young women and girls in the employment or care of wealthy families experienced similar fates. Pregnancies resulting from abuse or coercion were terminated or hidden. The girls were sent away, paid off, or silenced through threats. The men responsible faced no accountability. The families' reputations remained intact. This was the darkest aspect of the architecture of silence, the way it protected not just indiscretions and mistakes, but genuine crimes, abuses of power that destroyed lives. The families who used the system to suppress these stories did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as pragmatic, as protecting their legacies, as doing what was necessary to preserve the status and wealth they had inherited. The victims were unfortunate, yes, but they were also expendable. Their suffering was regrettable but necessary. The family's reputation was more important. This logic, brutal and cold, was rarely stated explicitly, but it underpinned every decision to pay off a victim, to send away a girl, to terminate a pregnancy, to silence a witness. The families believed, or convinced themselves to believe, that they were doing what was best for everyone. The alternative, public scandal, would damage the family, yes, but it would also expose the victims to scrutiny, to judgment, to a society that often blamed women and girls for the crimes committed against them. Silence, the families told themselves, was protective. It spared everyone the pain of exposure. But this rationalization was self-serving and false. The silence protected the families, not the victims. Alice Hartwell was sent away not for her own good, but to prevent scandal. The pregnancy was terminated not to spare her suffering, but to erase evidence. The ongoing payments were not acts of charity, but hush money, ensuring that she would never speak about what had happened. The victims of these suppressed scandals carried their trauma alone, unable to seek justice, unable to tell their stories, unable to find community with others who had suffered similarly. They were isolated by design, cut off from each other, and from any possibility of holding the powerful accountable. And the families, protected by silence, continued their practices, confident that the system would shield them from consequences no matter what they did. This was the true architecture of silence, not just a method for managing scandal, but a comprehensive structure for maintaining power, for ensuring that wealth and status placed certain people above the law, above accountability, above the basic moral standards that governed everyone else. The system worked because most people, faced with the choice between speaking out and facing destruction, or accepting money and staying silent, chose survival. The families counted on this. They understood human vulnerability, the need for security, the fear of retaliation. and they exploited it, efficiently and without remorse, for generations. The system that had protected old money families for decades began to crumble in the 1920s. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, as the world changed in ways that made silence harder to buy and scandals harder to suppress. The first change was technological. The rise of tabloid journalism, cheap mass-market newspapers that did not depend on advertising from wealthy families, created new outlets for scandal that could not be easily controlled. Papers like the New York Daily News and the New York Daily Mirror made their profits from sensational stories that attracted working-class readers. These readers did not care about maintaining the reputations of families they would never meet. They wanted drama, scandal, exposés that confirmed their suspicions about how the wealthy lived. The old money families had relationships with respectable newspapers, the Times, the Tribune, the Globe. They could pressure editors, threaten to withdraw advertising, call in favours accumulated over years of mutual benefit. But the tabloids were outside that network. They had no stake in protecting the powerful. They thrived on exposing them. In 1923, a tabloid published a story about a married heir to a railroad fortune who had been arrested for soliciting prostitution. The family tried to suppress it, offering money to the editor, threatening legal action, using their connections to pressure the newspaper's distributors. Nothing worked. The story ran. It was picked up by other tabloids. Within days, it was national news. The family's reputation was damaged. The heir's marriage ended. The business empire suffered as investors questioned the stability of leadership. The family had spent over $50,000 trying to stop the story from being published, and it had all been wasted. The scandal was public. The damage was done. This incident sent a shockwave through the old money families. It demonstrated that the methods that had worked for generations were no longer reliable. A new kind of journalism existed, one that operated outside the traditional networks of influence, one that could not be bought or intimidated. The families realized they needed to adapt, but they were not sure how. The second change was legal. The 1920s saw the rise of federal regulations that made certain kinds of corruption harder to hide. The Securities and Exchange Commission, though not created until 1934, was preceded by state-level regulations that required more transparency in business dealings. The Federal Trade Commission, established in 1914, began investigating anti-competitive practices that old money families had engaged in for years without scrutiny. These regulatory bodies created records, investigations, public hearings. They made it harder to conduct business in the shadows, harder to suppress information about financial impropriety, harder to buy silence when federal investigators were asking questions. The families still had influence. They still had lawyers and political connections. But the landscape was more complicated than it had been. A scandal that might have been resolved with a quiet payoff in 1900 now risked triggering a federal investigation in 1925. The stakes were higher, the control was weaker. The third change was cultural. The 1920s were a decade of social upheaval. Women won the right to vote in 1920. The younger generation, shaped by World War I, rejected many of the Victorian values that had defined their parents' generation. There was less deference to authority, less automatic respect for wealth and status, more willingness to question the powerful and demand accountability. This cultural shift made it harder for old money families to rely on the unspoken agreements that had sustained the architecture of silence. A journalist in 1925 was less likely to defer to a wealthy family's request for discretion than a journalist in 1900 would have been. A victim offered hush money in 1928 was more likely to refuse, to demand justice rather than compensation, than a victim in 1905. The world was changing, and the family's methods, effective for so long, were becoming obsolete. In 1929, the stock market crashed, the Great Depression began, and the old money families, though they remained wealthy by any standard, lost the aura of invincibility that had protected them. When millions of people were unemployed and starving, the spectacle of wealthy families suppressing scandals with money seemed not just unjust but obscene. Public tolerance for the excesses and secrets of the rich evaporated. Journalists who might have been sympathetic in better times became hostile. Politicians who had been allies became critics. The social contract that had allowed the families to operate with impunity was broken by economic collapse. The families tried to adapt. They hired public relations consultants, a new profession in the 1920s to manage their images and spin negative stories. They became more strategic about which scandals to suppress and which to address publicly, calculating that in some cases a carefully managed admission was less damaging than a cover-up that might be exposed. They withdrew from public life, reducing their visibility, hoping that lower profiles would mean fewer opportunities for scandal. But these were defensive measures, reactions to a world that no longer accommodated their power as easily as it once had. By 1930, the architecture of silence that had protected old money families for decades was crumbling. It still functioned, scandals were still suppressed, victims were still paid off, journalists were still pressured. But it no longer worked with the same efficiency, the same certainty, the same absolute control. The families that had built their security on the assumption that money could buy silence were learning that the world had changed and that their power, though still significant, was no longer absolute. The beginning of the end had arrived, and though the system would continue for years, though scandals would still be hidden and victims still silenced, the old money families knew, even if they did not admit it, that their control was slipping, that the machinery they had relied on was breaking down, and that the future would be more complicated, more uncertain, and more accountable than the past they had dominated for so long. Today, the old money families that once suppressed scandals with impunity are mostly gone, their fortunes dispersed, their names fading from memory, their secrets buried so deeply that even historians struggle to uncover them. The mansions they lived in have been demolished or converted into museums. The newspapers they controlled have closed or been sold. The lawyers and fixers who maintained the architecture of silence have died, taking their knowledge to graves that no one visits. But the ghosts remain. Not literal ghosts, but the echoes of lives bent and broken by a system designed to protect wealth at any cost. Sarah Bennett, who took Vanderbilt money and lived under a false name in San Francisco. Eleanor Worthington, who spent decades believing she had been abandoned by the man she loved. Daniel Crawford, who traded his ideals for a job and spent the rest of his life wondering if he had made the right choice. Alice Hartwell, who carried trauma from childhood into adulthood and died without ever speaking about what had been done to her. These people, and thousands like them, were sacrificed to protect reputations that are now forgotten, legacies that dissolved as soon as the money ran out, families that believed they were building something permanent but were really just postponing the inevitable. The architecture of silence worked for a time. It kept scandals hidden, reputations intact, fortunes secure, but it could not prevent decay. The families aged, the wealth diluted, the names lost significance, and the secrets they had paid so much to protect became irrelevant, not because they were exposed, but because no one cared anymore. Who remembers the Wendells now, except as a cautionary tale about hoarding? Who thinks about the Vanderbilts, except in the context of museums they endowed? The old money families spent fortunes to preserve their legacies, but legacies are fragile things, more dependent on memory than money, more shaped by the stories people tell than the silence people maintain. In the end, the families that suppress scandals so aggressively are remembered, when they are remembered at all, not for what they built but for what they hid. The scandals, even the ones that were successfully suppressed, cast shadows. Historians find fragments, letters, diary entries, legal documents that hint at stories that were never told. They piece together narratives from scraps, speculating about what happened, who was paid off, which powerful man escaped consequences. The architecture of silence was not strong enough to erase the past. It only made the past harder to see, which means that when fragments do emerge, they carry the weight of mystery, the sense that something dark and significant was hidden. The victims of suppressed scandals left almost no record. Sarah Bennett died as Sarah Whitman, with an obituary that revealed nothing about the Vanderbilts. Eleanor Worthington, Ashford's obituary mentioned her charity work and her grandchildren, but not the summer of 1902. Daniel Crawford was remembered as a businessman, not as the journalist who tried to expose corruption. Alice Hartwell's brief obituary noted her skills as a seamstress and her devotion to her family, but said nothing about the Bradford family or what had been done to her when she was 12 years old. These people were erased by design, their stories suppressed, their voices silenced, their suffering minimized or ignored. The families who suppressed their stories believed they were acting pragmatically, protecting themselves, ensuring continuity. But they were also committing a kind of violence, not physical, but structural, a violence that denied people the right to their own stories, that insisted some lives mattered less than others, that wealth and status conferred not just privilege but impunity. This violence is the real legacy of the architecture of silence, not the mansions or the fortunes or the reputations, but the uncounted lives that were damaged or destroyed to protect them. We cannot know how many there were. The system was designed to leave no trace, but we can guess, based on the fragments that have survived, that the number was large, that the suffering was real, and that the cost, measured in human terms rather than dollars, was staggering. The old money families are gone now, but the logic that sustained them persists. Wealth still buys silence, power still suppresses scandal, victims are still paid off, witnesses still intimidated, stories still killed before they reach the public. The methods have changed, the tools are different, but the fundamental architecture remains. Non-disclosure agreements replace handshake deals. Public relations firms replace family lawyers, but the outcome is the same. The powerful protect themselves, the powerless bear the cost, and the machinery that enables this, the lawyers, the fixers, the media companies, the financial institutions, continues to function because it is profitable, because it serves the interests of those who control it, and because most people, faced with the choice between speaking out and surviving, choose survival. The lesson of the old money families and their suppressed scandals is not that silence cannot be bought. It can. The lesson is that silence, once purchased, is not permanent. Time erodes it. Memories leak, documents survive, and eventually, often decades after everyone involved is dead, the truth emerges incomplete and fragmentary but undeniable. But the Vanderbilt incident that never happened is now known, at least in outline, because historians found references in letters and interviewed descendants of people involved. The Drexel embezzlement is documented in family papers that were eventually donated to archives. The Morrison scandal, though successfully prosecuted, has been largely forgotten, but the trial transcripts survive. Alice Hartwell's story may never be fully known, but the pattern of abuse and suppression she experienced was repeated so many times, in so many families, that her individual case becomes representative of a larger systemic failure. The ghosts of what was hidden do not rest quietly. They haunt the present, not as spectres but as questions. What else was suppressed? Who else was silenced? How many lives were bent or broken to protect reputations that no longer matter? The answers are lost, buried in archives no one has searched, destroyed in fires no one investigated, forgotten by families who have moved on. But the questions remain, lingering in the air like smoke, reminding us that silence is never complete, that suppression is never total, and that the past, no matter how much money is spent to erase it, has a way of returning when we least expect it. The old money families believed they were building legacies that would last forever. They spent fortunes protecting those legacies from scandal, from exposure, from the truth. But in the end, the only thing that lasted was the damage they caused, the lives they disrupted, the people they silenced. Their mansions are gone, their fortunes are dispersed, their names are fading. But the architecture of silence they built and the ghosts it created remain. The morning light comes through the windows of a mansion that no longer exists, touching rooms that have been empty for decades, illuminating dust that settled long ago. Somewhere in an archive a letter sits unread, written by someone who was paid to stay silent and kept their promise until death made the promise irrelevant. Somewhere in a cemetery, a grave bears a name that reveals nothing about the life lived or the scandal suppressed. The machinery is quiet now. The lawyers are gone, the fixers dead, the editors retired, the families scattered, their fortunes diluted, their power diminished by time and history, and the simple fact that nothing, no matter how much money protects it, lasts forever. The scandals that were hidden with such care, such expense, such ruthless efficiency, have faded into obscurity, not because they were successfully suppressed, but because the world moved on and forgot why they mattered. And in that forgetting, the silence finally achieved what money never could. Oblivion. The mansions are gone, the fortunes are spent, the names are whispered in archives and nowhere else, and the only thing that remains is the question that no one asked when it mattered most. What was it all for? Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. What secrets do you think old money families are still hiding today?